My name is Heidi Dix, and I have been a social worker for over 25 years. Now, in that time, I've worked in both adult and children's services, but pretty much most of my time has been spent in recent years working with and within the specialism of youth justice. So until last year, I was a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Suffolk, and I was there teaching there this morning because I'm rubbish at endings. So even though we know endings are really important in social work, I'm not very good at them. So I was back there teaching this morning. I left the university to take up the position of the director of the Youth Justice Institute, and our website is currently under review. So I'm not going to say huge about the institute, because those of you who are interested can either contact me or can do a bit of Googling and find out who we are. But we're a relatively new organisation, and we're looking to bring together academics and practitioners and children together to make sure that we are utilising the best evidence out there to support positive outcomes for children. And I am delighted to say that I have big shoes to fill, in that I have recently, and this is my very first meeting as co-chair with Caroline Bald, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with if you're a member of the BASW Criminal Justice Group, have taken over as the co-chair. So I'm delighted to be joining you. And I think we've got people who have been long-standing members of the BASW Criminal Justice Group with us today. And then we've got lots of people who are joining the event this afternoon. And we've still got people joining us, which is wonderful. So enough about me. And I am going to hand over to Diane Wills in a moment. We're delighted, Diane, that you were joining us. Diane has a probation background. We were just talking about that a bit earlier, weren't we? So Diane is a qualified probation officer and has been for nearly 25 years now, I think, and has, for a chunk of that time, worked with people who display sexually harmful behaviours and or sexually harm. And a lot of that time you've worked in both the secure estate and within the community, and I'm sure, Diane, you'll be able to say a bit more about your work in a moment. And I understand you're currently working on an MOJ commissioned project as a therapist on the Healthy Sex programme, alongside offering some consultancy to social work agencies. So we're delighted that you are joining us this afternoon, and if that's okay with you, I'm just going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much for coming today. I'm Diane Wills, and I'm a member of the BASW Criminal Justice Social Work Group. As Heidi said, my background is really in the probation service. So I qualified as a probation officer in London in, I think, 2001 or thereabouts. I specialised in working with people who sexually harm. I worked on the community sex offender group work programme for a long time, and then I was seconded to the Home Office to work in the public protection team, working on policy around kind of sexual harm. I am a social worker as well, so I'm a registered social worker, which kind of happened a little bit by default, because I very impulsively moved to Scotland, and in Scotland they don't have a separate probation service. Criminal justice is still retained into social work, so I had to become a social worker to work up there. So that's kind of why I'm a social worker, but I've retained my registration, and I work as a practice educator. I do some associate lecturing as well, and I work very much alongside social services. If you know Willis Palmer as an independent social work agency, so I'm the lead consultant for forensic risk assessments with them. So I do a lot of QA work for them and consultation. Obviously, I do some risk assessment and consultation for social work agencies as well, and for social work departments, usually child protection teams. So my career has taken a bit of a windy path. I'm very multidisciplined. It is by no means any kind of planned event. This hasn't been as a result of any planning. This has just been the way things have worked out. So I'm also a psychotherapist now. So I'm a psychodynamic psychotherapist, and I'm a coach. And part of my business also is about organisational training around leadership coaching and sexual harassment training. So I really am a bit of a jack of all trades. I do some writing as well. So I did co-publish a book a few years ago on working with people who sexually harm, and I contribute to articles and journals, and I'm a peer reviewer for a couple of journals as well. Yeah, so I do quite a lot of stuff, and as I say, it wasn't designed in any way in this way. It was just how things have turned out. I've put there a career in sexual deviance because there's a long-standing joke among sort of my friends about, you know, if I was to go on Mastermind, that would probably be my specialist subject. So and I'm that person. So when anything terrible happens, you know, in the community, when there's a big case or something, you know, I'm the person that my friends will go, I saw that the other day and I thought of you. So I'm always associated with pretty awful things. Having said that, I realise I've not put a slide about a health warning, but I probably should say something about that. I'm not going to talk in any detail about the material I work with or any of the content, but clearly this is about working with people who sexually harm. So I am aware that there'll be several people in the room who've been affected by sexual harm. So I realise that talking about this work can feel quite triggering for people and can feel quite difficult. So I just would encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And please, if you want to contact me afterwards, you can go ahead and do that, and I can signpost you to relevant agencies. I don't talk about my work very much because of those reasons. So this is a bit of an unfamiliar environment for me, I would say. You'll notice that when I'm talking about my work, I will talk about, I will use person first language. So I will refer to people as people who sexually harm or people who sexually harm others. I very rarely will use the term sex offender because like all aspects of social work and all aspects of life generally, I would always choose to use people first language. And I wouldn't choose to refer to people by the worst thing that they've ever done. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, I think, as well, in values, thinking about our values and how we write about people who commit these kinds of offences as well. I can't tell you what I had to go through to have permission to put this slide on. So this presentation was supposed to be a little while ago, but because it is about the Ministry of Justice, they are very thoughtful about who they let talk about their work and how that happens. So I had to get lots of permission to put this slide on. So as Heidi said, so a lot of my work, my bread and butter work, if you like, is that I am commissioned by the Ministry of Justice to work with male adults in the prison estate who have committed serious sexual offences on what's called the Healthy Sex programme. So I'm both a therapist and a supervisor for that programme. I would say that it's a bit of a combination between risk management and therapy. So it's not like conventional interventions in the prison estate or in probation. So you've probably heard of programmes like Horizon and maybe Kaizen. So it's quite different from those, although some of the same concepts and language is used. This is very much more of a therapeutic base. It's a one-to-one intervention. It's very resource intensive, as you can imagine. So I work with somebody over about 3-month period, and I see them twice a week. So it's about 3 hours a week of exploring people's offending behaviour, exploring the context of their life, and helping people develop skills and strategies to manage safely in the future. So it takes a biopsychosocial approach. So we look at things like neurobiology, we look at those kind of environmental factors, and we look at all sorts of other kind of factors that might make people the people that they are today. So there's very much a kind of ethos of a lot of what has led people to think in particular ways and to behave in certain ways has not necessarily been their fault. So the way that we're brought up, those people around us as we were growing up, the experiences that we had as children, and all those kinds of things are not people's fault. But obviously they have to take responsibility for their behaviour as adults. So that's very much the approach. It draws on a wide range of psychology principles. So it's very much a programme that sits within forensic psychology in prison. So I'm probably one of only very few around the country people who aren't a forensic psychologist who work on this. So that's where it's located. We use what might be described as first wave psychology principles. So there is some behaviour modification work that can be used. So that's quite direct work with people using techniques like directed masturbation. We also use sort of standard CBT type interventions, but what's kind of coming more into all the interventions that HMPPS run are things like compassion focused therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. We heavily use those, and there's a lot of work around mindfulness, there's a lot of work about emotional regulation. And for me personally, this isn't an MOJ view, this is my view. This is really, all of this work is about helping individuals develop some self-awareness and understand what their triggers are, understand the functions of their behaviour, and to develop strategies in order to be able to manage those things much more safely in the future. So I don't know if people are aware that there's a sort of similar programme in the community, which is called the NOTA Individual Treatment Programme, NITP, which is quite similar to HSP, but it has a much more sociological emphasis, I would say, as opposed to psychological. But I mean, that's my view. That's not the view of the authors necessarily. That is available in the community. The issue that tends to arise with it is about who funds that, because it's owned by NOTA. So I don't know if people might be familiar with NOTA, National Organisation for the Treatment of Abusers. So I'm a member of that. It's not a programme that has been kind of bought by any particular agency. So this is very much about people being able to access and pay for this on a ad hoc basis. So it tends to be really expensive. My experience, I've actually just had an experience where a local authority have wanted to purchase this kind of work, but haven't been able to agree to fund that. So that tends to be my experience of it. I think NOTA have currently paused the training for the programme for those kinds of reasons. So, but just to let you know, I suppose that there is a resource that's very similar that's out there and available. So I was just thinking about how the context of how people with sexual convictions might come up in social work, in ways in which you might need to kind of work with people. So I was thinking child protection is the kind of obvious one, and if I'm working with social work departments, that tends to be how I become involved. So there's usually something around either an historical conviction or allegation or a current allegation of some kind, and obviously people get very worried about that, so they bring in someone like me to do risk assessments or consultation around that particular family. I would say that it's usually in the context of risk assessments, as I think local authorities tend to want to put someone else's name on the bottom of a report. There's increasing involvement with older adults because the prison population is becoming much older. So people are coming out of prison with very complex needs, but also the agencies involved are also having to manage the sexual risk around that person. Just because somebody's getting older doesn't necessarily mean their risk has reduced, particularly depending on the person. I'm seeing lots more involvement around that. And again, adults with complex needs, so maybe adults with disabilities, neurodivergence, all kinds of things like that. So there are various kind of ways that social work interacts with people with sexual convictions. I didn't put on there the youth offending team, which is obviously a multidisciplinary team, but that's because I only work with adults, so I don't work with young people. So clearly that's another area where social work would be involved with people with sexual convictions. I was just thinking about multi-agency working and the kinds of agencies that tend to be involved with people with sexual convictions in the community. You know, got the key agencies there, social work and probation and the police, and MAPA tends to be involved, so multi-agency public protection arrangements. So when people are released from prison, MAPA tends to oversee how that person's going to be monitored in the community, or restrictions might be in place, and there's all sorts of kind of meetings involved with all the different agencies who have involvement with that person about how that person's risk is managed in the community. So housing get involved quite a lot, and housing is a real problem at the moment for people, particularly with the early release schemes and things like that. So that's really putting huge amounts of pressure on housing resources for people with sexual convictions. And other services like third sector agencies such as substance use or circles of support, those kinds of agencies which are really kind of propping up some of these statutory agencies and working really hard to support people with less and less access to funding. And therapy services sometimes, so usually that's private therapy. If somebody can afford to have therapy, that's what they might do. So I work sometimes with privately funded clients. I also do some pro bono work with a couple of people who are on licence. And there are a couple of agencies which specifically train people to work with people with sexual convictions so that they understand some of the particular needs of that community. Some of the challenges and rewards for me in doing the work, I guess thinking about challenges first, I'm aware that we're all drawn to the work that we do for particular reasons, and it's not a coincidence that we end up doing what we do for a living, and that's the case for all of us, in my view. So it's something that I talk to when I work as a practice educator with students. It's something that I would be talking with students about why we're drawn to this particular work. So in my case, I'm clearly drawn to work of a very extreme nature. I'm clearly drawn to work that most other people don't want to do, and I've had to do a lot of work on myself about why that is, work through some of those processes. And it's interesting work in that it is very kind of personally triggering and continues to be so, even with sort of 20 odd years of experience. It continues to raise issues from life that perhaps I haven't looked at in a particular way, or haven't dealt with, or I haven't worked through, and that sort of continues to happen because sex and sexuality and sexual harm are very are part of our life, and all the emotional context that goes with that. So that's part of the challenge, is kind of working through some of that stuff. As I said when I started as well, talking about my work can be very difficult, so I don't talk about it very much in polite circles. Obviously, people that are close to me know what I do for a living, but I tend to not discuss it very much with many other people. And if I do disclose what I do for a living, then you have to kind of work. You have to be prepared to work with the response to that. Yeah, there's lots of kind of issues there. I really think that people who have been convicted of serious sexual convictions, serious sexual offences, are in a bit of a dire situation in the community criminal justice system in this country. The level of services is really poor, and I would say that's both within the prison estate and in the community. I think there's a real lack of trauma-informed support, and just from my experience working within the prison estate, it's evident on a daily basis the lack of kind of trauma-informed support, the way people are treated and the expectations on people. And once people are back in the community, there really is very little out there particularly actually over the longer terms. So when someone first comes out of prison, there might be resources out there in that first year. So things like projects like Circles of Support, for instance, provides an absolutely invaluable service, and they're absolutely brilliant. And I was a trustee for my local Circles project for 9 years. I think they're fantastic. That support lasts for a year. When people are out for a longer period, the resources sort of dry up. So I'm currently supporting someone on a pro bono basis in the community who was a lifer. So he was sentenced to life imprisonment. So has served about 25 years in prison, is now on a life licence, has been out for a couple of years, and the services have really dried up. And actually what happens to people who are in prison, so people get very traumatised by not only their life before the offending, but they get traumatised by the offending itself, even though they're the ones doing it, and they get traumatised by the prison system. So if you've got someone who has served 25 years in a prison, that's going to take more than a year to even begin to kind of emotionally regulate after that. So if you've been out a couple of years, you're probably only at the start of that process of being able to live anywhere near a kind of normal life, and actually the services have withdrawn by that point. So there really is a lack of support out there. I think some of the challenges are around the views about perpetrators versus victims, and I think that's difficult, and I think it's difficult for us all to manage as individuals, and I think it's difficult for us to manage as professionals. I also think it's really difficult for the government to manage that balance. And perpetrators are often victims themselves, not necessarily of sexual abuse, but certainly of some kind of abuse or lack of care or all sorts of things that have happened in their lives. For me, there's a real imbalance there, I think, about how we think about perpetrators and victims. I think for me as an independent practitioner, I think I get really frustrated by the ownership of information and expertise. And I think it's very much perceived as if it's held by large agencies. So they tend to be large, obviously statutory agencies like the MOJ, and also large academic institutions that tend to be quite dominant in this field. For me as an independent practitioner, it's quite frustrating that there is a sort of ownership of knowledge, if you like, and I think that what that has led to is very limited perspectives about sexual harm and why people sexually harm. I think it's viewed through very narrow lenses in the criminal justice system and in academia, and that frustrates me on a pretty much daily basis, really, because I think it's a much broader issue than is currently worked with in a particular way. Some of the rewards for me are that it just feels like really privileged work to me, and I've always felt that way. So I always think we go into this kind of work, whether it be probation or social work or psychology or any other helping professions, I always think like we go into this work because like we have this desire to want to help people and to really understand people. You know, we're fascinated by people generally, aren't we? And we kind of, you know, we're really curious. In my experience, what ends up happening is that, you know, we tend to sit at our laptops or our computers and write reports or fill in forms. So for me, this, you know, it feels like privileged work. It really feels like this is the work that I kind of wanted to do. I wanted to work with people. I wanted to be curious with people. I wanted to understand people and their motivations. So for me, it just feels like such a privilege, and also feels like a privilege being able to sit with somebody whilst they work through some really, really difficult stuff. And that's always a privilege, whether it be someone who I'm working with because they've sexually harmed or anybody else. I always think it's a privilege to actually sit with somebody as they kind of go through their own process and their own journey with self-awareness and personal development, really. So I personally find it completely privileged. I feel like I'm making a difference. Sometimes, that's really tiny, and sometimes I guess I feel like I don't make any difference at all. What I really try hard to do is not do any more harm, and that's my kind of starting point, really. But sometimes, I can really feel like I'm making a difference to someone's life, and that's just an amazing thing to be able to do. And in that, if I'm working with somebody who's sexually harmed somebody else, then I feel like I'm contributing to public protection. There are no guarantees. I can't guarantee that people I work with won't go out and do something horrific. But I think there are people who've really, really developed their self-awareness and really understand themselves in a much more profound way than they perhaps have done previously, and probably will be able to manage themselves much more healthily and much more safely in the community. And that feels, so it feels like I'm making a contribution, and it really is like, when you do this kind of work, you really are you're rolling in the deep, you're really in the deep, dark stuff with people. And I really love that. And I guess that says something about me, doesn't it? That I really like the dark places. If you're kind of familiar with Jungian psychology and Jungian psychotherapy, you'll know about kind of working with shadow, and that's where I'm happiest. So, like I say, I'm sure that says loads about me. Go into, just going to kind of mention values, really. Values are really important, and really do act as kind of guiding principles for me. My main values are compassion, integrity, and responsibility, and that kind of runs through my business, whether I'm working with someone who's sexually harmed or whether I'm working with an organisation. That really kind of runs through my core, values around risk management and public protection versus compassion and catharsis. I mean, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think we can do both. And, going back to what I was saying about language at the beginning, I think people can generally hear hard things if we say those things in a way which demonstrates our understanding of why they did what they did and how they see the world. So I think that's really important when we're writing reports and risk assessments and things to, it's clearly we've got knowledge and expertise and all of those things, and we're able to formulate and create an hypothesis. But actually what we really need to do is understand how that person sees the world and their location in it and how they see themselves in relation to other people's. For me, that's the real kind of crux of writing a really good report. And also it's also about supporting their ability to change, because we all have capacity to change, no matter how far down a particular road we've gone. We've got capacity to change, all of us have. So really thinking about working with somebody, and of course we've got to protect the public. Of course, that's number one. That's my original training. I was in probation in the kind of era of public protection, and that was very much the key, and that goes through my core as well. But I think we can do that and support people to change. And taking opportunities, I think it's really important that we take every opportunity to help someone transform their lives, and every opportunity that we get to explore that kind of cognitive dissonance about where people are and the difference between that and where they'd like to be, using those kind of motivational skills and holding people and containing them. For me, that's really important, to take every single opportunity to do that. And walking with someone in their pain, I tend to see people when they're at their lowest, when they're at a pretty low ebb. For me, it's about just walking beside somebody when they're in a really, really dark place and when they're hurting, and just being that person who's just with them, really, and that there are no binaries. So I would describe myself as pathologically optimistic, always have been, don't quite know where that comes from, but I generally am. And I'm really invested in people, and I'm really invested in people's future. And so I think I can be pathologically optimistic, but I think, and I can still see risk, you know. So just because I really want somebody to do incredibly well in their future does not mean that I don't see where the risk lies and how the risk can escalate. So I think both things can be true. I think I can be appalled at what someone has done and still really like them. So I tend to really like men I work with. I tend to get on with them really well. Part of me is sort of had to go through that process of questioning that. How can I like somebody that has done something so terrible? You know, but, you know, both of those things can be true. And I think things are difficult and people can still change. So I think, you know, for me, there are no binaries really. We can hold both of those things at the same time, and there are lots of truths in any kind of situation, I think. Yeah, so this is just a little visual I did about how I feel about this work. So, and that kind of sums it up for me. It's, you know, it's hard. It's really hard work in all sorts of ways, but it's beautiful as well, and it's joyful. And there are just these moments which make everything kind of worthwhile. So yeah, you know, this is how I see it really, as this little kind of, you know, these little moments where people can grow and people can develop, despite their backgrounds, despite the criminal justice system, despite what they've done, people still can flourish and grow. Yeah, and I think that might be about it, apart from questions.
Thank you. I hope, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Sorry to not, I tried to join in with two computers, and that's when you started to hear yourself twice, so that wasn't really clever. And so it's meant I'm joining you from the front of a classroom, so you've got a whole host of students sitting in the dark, a little shocked by some of the things I've just heard. So I really appreciate it, and sorry not to introduce you. Diane and I actually presented not that long ago, did we? And we realised we've been crossing paths about 20 years.
Yeah, I know, isn't that weird?
Oh, so being in the position I am, and I wondered if I could bring a conversation that we've had today in the classroom. So I'm teaching MA social work students in their first year. I'm looking at them, and we were talking about, we were moving into criminology, and it's certainly a current conversation. And you mentioned a little bit about your educations, because I too went back to Scotland to do social work when probation was removed, and I think social work is the narrower as having lost criminal justice. I think as well as probation, I think has got its own issues in terms of losing us. So I think there's a lot to be from both. Working with children, and where somebody presents harm to children generally in the home, how do you feel social workers have access to supports? Because what we looked at each other thinking, yes, we all in principle would want to protect children, but children have that right to family life as well. And also we know that people we work with continue to have families. At which point are we able to access resources? Where would they start to look to find out more? Because I know some people here were wanting to go away and find out about practice. So it's how do you work with somebody not necessarily with a conviction? Who pays for it? And what's available in different counties?
Yeah, and I think they're really good questions. Sorry, I can't answer them because some local authorities will hold sort of some particular expertise, and some social work regions, some social work departments will actually recruit specific social workers to work in kind of this kind of area in terms of criminal justice and forensic social work and around kind of people with convictions. But I think that's quite rare. So generally speaking, when there is someone who presents in a family with this kind of concern, they generally bring people like me in to do a risk assessment. And here is where I'm going to speak quite frankly about that, because of the nature of how things are in terms of turnaround times and things like that. It tends to be a pretty quick and dirty piece of work. In my mind, that's just not good enough. So when I do an assessment, and this is why I don't assessments very often these days. So when I do an assessment, I will work with someone over a series of weeks, because that gives somebody a chance to reflect, to think, to maybe be curious with themselves. You know, what I'm not doing is spending a few hours with somebody and then making recommendations about their life and their children's lives, or the lives of children that they're involved with, because I think that's not on, actually. I think the current situation is just not good enough. So like this, I won't name the authority. So a local authority recently came to me and said, how much would you charge for working with this person on a one-to-one basis for a period, over 6 months or whatever. I came back with, a fee that was about as low as I could go, because it's, I know it's public sector, and I'm never going to I'm always going to be fair about that, but they just can't afford it. They just cannot afford to do that. It's tricky.
It is tricky, but I think increasingly people are asking questions. So things like young people with SEND presenting sexually risky behaviours that risk if we don't address it. But it sounds like this could be a bigger conversation, and maybe we can have a conversation again, maybe another webinar. Me pulling you in. So I've got a couple more questions. You mentioned working with men. Have you any experience of working with women offenders of sexual harm, and is there becoming more common in society?
Yeah, so I've got experience of risk assessments with female offenders. So that tends to come up again, sort of, in kind of child protection type ways. In terms of like Ministry of Justice work and programmes and interventions, no, because they're all validated for male populations. So they tend not to get the same provision as men do. And that goes for also, there are a lot of discrepancies around race with that as well. So there's all the kind of usual discrepancies that we would see replicated in every other part of the criminal justice system.
That's really helpful. So Reconnect is a relatively new project, working really, it's the very logic of joined up thinking around health and the transition and aiding the transition, which we know, I think with the new sentencing review is going to be actually a real issue, that we know that the prisons are struggling, but we also know that the community services are struggling, as we've just discussed around social work. So Reconnect is a way of actually helping people back into the community. I wondered to what extent, Diane, do you think your training has helped you to do that? And is there a shortcut to what you've learned over these 25 years? How can we bottle it?
I think the key is not to panic. So I think this issue brings up a lot of our own stuff, right, and a lot of panic and a lot of concern. So I think for me it would be about paying attention to what's going on for me as a professional, and that will give you kind of some information about the kind of circumstances that you're working with and the dynamics that you're working with. So for me it's all about that kind of self-awareness and really noticing what's happening for you, and really kind of checking out those things really in terms of what's happening in the projection, what's happening in the transference, so I really think that's where things like clinical supervision come in, and where things like that kind of group process supervision that used to happen back in the day, when we're kind of working with people and we're really kind of working out actually what's going on for us when we're working with this person. So for me, that's the answer really.
No, that's really helpful. We're coming to the end. Does anybody else have any questions we'd like to unmute and ask? I know my students are just leaving to go to the next class, so thank you for coming. Was it good? Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Diane. We've got a whole back catalogue of recordings specifically around youth offending, for example, or children with parents in prison. So what we're hoping to do is curate a really quite strong space that you can go to for quick dip in and outs of areas of criminal justice, social work practice that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise have covered. But really, thanks so much, Diane. It's been a pleasure to see you again. And thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Been lovely seeing you again.